Hey.
If we may, I think it might be useful. There was a great question that came in from Gabby that was basically saying, well, okay, how do we negotiate all of this? Her question was, do we as teachers impose our own understanding of the three elements you've presented, or do we confirm to our students' understanding of the three? And perhaps can I just flesh that out a little bit with an example? And I hope in so doing to be able to answer what I think is Gabby's question. And this actually goes back probably about 20 years when I was teaching a high-level C1 plus borderline C2 group in a private language school in the north of England, in Scarborough. And in that class, there was an Italian Navy officer who was a really keen language learner. He was very outgoing in terms of his personality and would always chip in and always had something to say. And what he said was always of interest. There was also a Korean student who was a little bit more reserved, but had immaculate English. And the difference between them culturally manifested itself in how they worked with turn taking. So the Korean student, if asked a question, would pause before answering and then would begin. Whereas the Italian student typically would be answering the question whilst it was still being asked. And this led one day to an almighty explosion of bad temper in the classroom. And the Italian was saying, well, you know, I just want to show my passion and I'm interested in what you're saying, Iyun, or whatever the lady's name was. And Iyun said, yes, but you never listen. Actually, this was nothing to do about good or bad listening skills. This was about two entirely different but equally valid ways culturally of manifesting respect for the other person. In the Italian speakers' cultural code, interest was indicated by showing how much they wanted to talk and respond to you as quickly as possible. Whereas for the cultural code for the Korean lady, this was manifested in pausing, waiting for you to finish, showing respect for the question, giving yourself time to think about a good answer, because that's what a respectful person does, and then reply. As soon as I explained this, you could see for both of them, there was a ting of a light bulb going off. And they became best friends. It was the lack of understanding that they were both expressing the same behaviors. I want to show respect for your point of view, but their cultures made them do it in very, very different ways. So it wasn't about one imposing on the other. It was about them coming to an understanding that they both had different ways and both were acceptable. The challenge happens when you transplant yourself with one set of behaviors into another culture, and then you have to decide, well, you know, how do I fit in? Which in a classroom can be quite an area
challenge.
It's a challenge and it needs a lot of sensitivity. So I hope, Gabby, that by illustration answers your question. Steve, what do you think? Have you had?
Well, no, I have a couple of things that I think about with this, and one of them is, particularly in the UK, we're very rarely teaching monocultural groups, so we feel that the student is transplanted to a place of British culture, but it's actually a place of multicultural, which is even more difficult to deal with. But that conversation that or that interchange there between the the Italian and the Korean makes me think of my time as a Cambridge speaking examiner, where you would find yourself in the Cambridge first exam, for example, and there's the turn taking part of the speaking exam. and you have two people who don't know each other, have never met before. And in the UK, they're often from clashing cultures, completely different cultures with different styles. And you do have those situations where you see that person clam up, close up completely because they feel that the other person is being overpowering. And there's not much you can do as the examiner in that situation, but I think there are things we can do as teachers to prep students for that. But yeah, it's hard, isn't it? One thing that I found really interesting, you were talking about Hofstede and this power distance, and I know somebody came up, well, there was a lot of chat about this in the chat room actually, and talking about negotiation. And I think our role in a multicultural classroom, as opposed to a monocultural classroom, is very nuanced as teachers. We have to be very careful as to what we're doing, really, because it's not necessarily negotiation always is the answer. Sometimes the answer is explanation rather than negotiation, explaining why we're teaching the way we're teaching. I don't know what you feel about that, though, Neil.
Is it the case that explanation precedes negotiation? That in order to negotiate successfully, you have to understand and have an explanation if it's something that's entirely outside your area of experience, or indeed something that's been visible to you? Because, going back to the cultural iceberg, turn taking is under the water. It's invisible. Yeah. If you've never sat down and you never thought about it, it's not going to occur to you that there could be different ways of doing it. So I think in terms of cultural and intercultural competence training, we begin by looking at some of these cultural dimensions as a way into understanding how different cultures work. When we understand them, we can then analyze situations and we can then start thinking about solutions for them. But you're absolutely right. The multicultural language, the multicultural, multilingual classroom is potentially an incredibly rich area, but it's also potentially an incredibly complicated area. And I think for the
really complicated.
For the teacher coming off a CELTA, where everything has been about the present perfect and the past simple, suddenly you're in the field of, oh my goodness, what's going on?
Yeah, it's really tough.
I mean, I don't know how many years of experience you've got behind you. I'm sure it's tens of years. Same for me. I learn something new practically every time I meet a new culture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, absolutely. And it's hard, isn't it? Because the students, I've known groups of students who want you to really deliver very teacher-focused lessons, very teacher-centered lessons. And I know that that's not really what I want to deliver. I know that it's not what I feel is best for them, but it's their experience of education up until arriving in my classroom has been that, and they feel uncomfortable with anything else. So it is, a case of what do we do? I kind of, being me, forge ahead and explain why we're learning the way we're learning and hope to ultimately bring them around to my way. But that doesn't always work,
And I think that's the heart of the matter for a multilingual, multinational language school in a country like America, Australia, and so on. Because at the end of the day, people typically will be working towards a norm.
Yeah.
And cultural training tells us there is more than one norm that is out there. But, realistically, there is going to be a dominant norm.
Yeah.
So, if when you meet language teachers who've trained in the UK, very often you can say, they went to International House. The International House way is very visible. And that's because it's a culture. but it doesn't necessarily mean to say it's any better
Yeah.
or any worse than the teacher that's come from the University of Sheffield, the University of Cardiff Met, where I train, or wherever. It's just a different way of doing things. It's back to that definition, way we do things around here. And I think there is a kind of value in remembering that when you come into a culture, that hopefully the people that you are joining will welcome you and want to learn about your culture, but there is an extent to which you do need to have flexibility to understand that the culture you're moving into is probably going to be the one that creates the norm. And I think that's why it's so important that language schools make it clear in their literature, not just language schools, universities, if you're coming to study in this country, this is what you should expect.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it just becomes very problematic potentially.
It really does. And I think many things become problematic, and particularly students' preparedness for other culture. I have a very incredibly recent experience of a student coming in and saying, I want a new teacher. I don't want to stay in that class. I do not want to stay in that class. And upon digging, it turns out that what had happened was it was a lesson about families and relationships. And the teacher had said to a young guy from the Middle East, what about you? Do you have a girlfriend, boyfriend? Which is a very acceptable question in the UK. And we wouldn't ever be so presumptive as to say to a young man in the UK, do you have a girlfriend? Because that's making a very presumptive question, a big presumption about that person. So that question of do you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, which had been asked around the room before getting to that student, that student was incredibly offended when it came to his turn and he was asked that. And it was a struggle to get that student to go back into class. So culture can be tough. And student preparedness for culture. What can we do? What can we do to prepare our students better for their arrival into a culture, into a different cultured classroom?
I think there are things that can be done. It's how much time and how much budget is available to do it. So I remember when I was researching this, I used to run a program for European project managers called Intercultural Competence in a European context, where we were looking at European-funded Erasmus projects with project partners from lots of different countries in the good old days when Erasmus happened in the UK. Political point there. And what you tended to find was that the project participants sometimes fell out with one another for these very reasons. They just didn't quite understand the behaviours that were coming from the other project participants. Oh, why is someone from country X always so slow? They never meet deadlines. Why is someone from country Y always on my back asking me if I finished the report? Well, it's an expectation of way of working. So the University of Lancaster did some research, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they looked at the experience of Erasmus students from the UK going to study for their year abroad.
Okay.
And they looked at ways in which they could do pre-departure training to get them thinking about how living in country, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, typically were the countries where they went to, might be different. So the students were prepared for this. Now, of course, this was easy because you had a university sending students to another university, and reciprocally, the students from the other university came to the UK, and it was a joint project. I think it's much more difficult in the language school context to do that because, you know, will the students might be busy students preparing to do a master's program in the UK? Are they going to read that web page that you ask them to look at that explains the expectations of behaviour in the classroom, or remember to bring an umbrella, it rains a lot in the UK, or your accommodation is going to be mixed? We had a conversation in the school where I work this morning where our admin officer had emailed the mother of a young lady from the Middle East, explaining that the residence is mixed. And the mother arrived and said, women only. I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, no, it's not. We have a floor that happens to be women only at the moment. Very happy for your daughter to go there, but the house is mixed, women only. And it is, but that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah,
just because this
tough.
one particular mother hadn't either chose not to, or didn't have time to, or simply wanted to reject those cultural behaviours that are acceptable in the UK, doesn't mean to say that every mother from that Middle Eastern country is going to think that way. You know, this is the danger of stereotyping, where we say everyone behaves in that way, rather than in that picture of the Arab male studying on his own. Most Arab males will study in groups, not all of them.
Yeah, I have a question about stereotyping. Actually, I know we looked at different course books, and when it came to, I think it was Life, where we turned the page and there's a picture of a Native American in full headdress with a horse, and a picture of South Asian ladies in sari, and my toes curled. And it's because I feel, and this is what we do so much in published materials that troubles me personally, is this stereotypical representation of culture. Japanese tea ceremony, another great example of this. As opposed to representing real life, as opposed to representing actually what is the real Native American experience, what is, you know, those ladies in saris were quite possibly that, I mean, beautiful colors and everything, but it is that stereotypical image of India. Probably what we're looking at is a group of computer engineers who by day are in an environment very similar to this. And that's the real lived experience of Indian ladies, rather than beautiful the image that we see. And I wonder how we break those cultural ideas in published materials. Do we need to break those cultural ideas? Is it the role of ELT teachers and publishers to break those stereotypes? Is it our job?
I think it would be a very brave and commercially strong publishing company that decided to totally abandon the stereotypical image. And I'm not sure that the stereotypical image is so bad as long as it is presented alongside the alternative. So, you know, we can all think about published materials. I mean, I remember there was a 1960s French course that talked about a Frenchman and an Englishman who met in London. And at some point, I'm not quite sure why the Englishman fell in the River Thames. And all you could see was this man with his bowler hat down the River Thames. Whereas the Frenchman stood on the bridge looking at him with, I am not kidding, a string of onions around it. Now, we've gone beyond that, fortunately. I think I didn't have the same reaction as you. I didn't have that toe curling experience looking at the ladies in saris or looking at the Native American. I just thought, actually, it's really nice to see someone who isn't white and British and middle class for a change. I think you're absolutely right, though, that we can go further. And perhaps if we have course books which are, as we saw with Voices, beginning to look at culture as the content, not just as the vehicle. So, you know, we're going to look at power distance. We're going to look at representation. Yeah. Here are some 3 pictures. Which would you choose as a typical representation of an Indian middle-class woman? Would it be the person sitting in front of the computer, the woman in the sari, or whatever? And I think that's where the conversation starts becoming interesting. Stereotypes. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I think stereotypes, I want to say, can be useful, because until we know they're stereotypes, we're just going to take them as the norm. rather than an extreme version of the norm, where we realize something is a stereotype. Only then can we challenge it.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think we do need to see both stereotype and norm together, because both of them are very representative of a lived experience, aren't they? Gabby has this really interesting question about representation of British culture in our course books.
Yes.
And for me, course books tend to be written by, as you say, middle class, middle-aged white folk living quite a nice experience, going to the theatre and going for dinner, and this isn't necessarily the experience of our students. And you know, in our course books, we tend to be, if we're looking at a conversation in an office, it's happening in the UK. And if we're looking at a conversation at a street market, it will be somewhere a little bit more exotic. And it would be interesting to see those roles reversed, to have the conversation in the office happening in Mexico City and the street market in London. I mean, all of which are very normal experiences for us, for our students, and for their families, you know.
Two things to say in response to that, I think. I mean, Gabby's making the point about students learning English as a lingua franca. So the businesswoman in Germany who is learning English in order to do business with someone in China. Now, in that situation, Gabby makes the point they won't be interested in culture. I think it's a very valid point to make of Gabby, that they won't necessarily be interested in English culture because they're never going to go there. However, I would challenge the assertion that culture itself is not valid. And this is why I think, in terms of 21st century skills, I perhaps disagree with people like Steve Hirschhorn, who question the validity of critical thinking. And although he never actually, I don't think, if I remember, and perhaps Hedy, you can correct me, whether 21st century skills was one of the things he questioned in terms of its validity in the language learning experience. But for me, if you're going to be doing business internationally, you have to have culture.
Of course.
You don't need to know necessarily the ins and outs of the tea ceremony, but you have to have the underlying skills to recognize things are going to be different. You may experience things that you don't understand or you don't like, but as I forget his name, there's the Culture Something series, which is a series of short books that look at the business cultures of a number of different countries. And the editor-in-chief once said to me, I said to him, how do you deal with that? How do you know everything? He said, well, I don't, but that's fine. Just ask. Yeah.
Is it Barry Tomlin? Barry Tomlin writes
It wasn't Barry, no. It wasn't an ELT course series.
Okay.
It was, I think it was called Culture Bound. So there would be Culture Bound Italy, Culture Bound Iceland, and so on. He said, if you're not sure, just ask. Can you tell me, how do you do things around here?
Yeah.
And me teaching that skill, openness, flexibility, psychological adaptation, those have been identified as being much more important as a skill set for business people working abroad than the competencies as an accountant or as a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Gabby says the German lady will learn about Chinese culture elsewhere. Does she need this to be part of the English course? I personally would say absolutely she does, because we are for example, in a business English class, we are teaching business communication, and English is part of that. And language is very nuanced, and part of that is culture. And it is there, isn't it? What do you think, Neil? Does this need to be part of the English course?
I think I'd agree with you, Steve. But I think the way I would go about working with that material in the classroom is to say, today we're looking at an example of, Gabby gives the example of Chinese culture, but then you open it out. What cultures are you interested in? What cultures are you going to be working in? What cultures do you come from? because cultural training very often begins at home.
Yeah.
Who are you? There is this concept of cultural profiling. So I would actually, in a business English course or in a 21st century skills course, actually hand it over to the students to actually say, well, okay, today we've done a reading about X aspect of business behavior in China. Now go and research your culture, or go and research another person's culture, and then present it back to each other. I'd use it as a stepping stone. So it's not, I'm learning about Chinese culture, I'm learning about how to articulate cultural behavior.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what is it about you and doing business with you that is important, and how might that be different with other people, and getting them to start thinking about, you know, for example, for me, it's really important that when I get a business card, I look at it and I don't put it in my trouser pocket, I put it in a jacket pocket. And how might other cultures be? Do you think that's important for everybody? I think there's lots of lovely classroom discussion that can come from this. I mean, really, really lovely. I think when you were talking about time and attitude to time, we see this, don't we? We see this all the time, that when we look down the register for our new class, we know who's going to be late and we know who's going to be on time, because we already have those stereotypical preconceived ideas in our brains of which nationalities will be late and which nationalities will be on time. And I feel sometimes that teachers get a little bit stuck on this, and it's very easy for teachers to see the nationality rather than the person, and make their expectations in advance of getting to know the student. And sometimes this can be a block to that teacher-student relationship. So I feel like it's really important to know the student before the nationality. I don't know what you guys think about that, if that's an experience you've had.
There's a pause there, because I'm thinking about this one. I think both are important, because there is the kind of a, how can I put it? There's a synergy, is there here? When we know the individual, we've got half or more than half of the jigsaw puzzle. When we know the culture, we have the other half. Put them together, one feeds into the other and vice versa. So if we take, for example, a stereotype of a Brazilian, oh, they're always late. The problem in that is the word they.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem is that not just they, but also we're expecting them to be late.
Yeah. But it is actually quite useful in terms of cultural profiling, not to, you see in the language, oh, the Brazilians, they are always late. We're actually making an implicit comparison. We're on time, they're late. We're othering. Whereas cultural training will say, I have a certain attitude to time. This culture has a different attitude to time. Are they late or am I early? Now, and again, it's this question of where is my starting point? In a UK language school where timing and starting on time tends to be enshrined as something that's very important, I think it's useful. In fact, I think it's critical where we have students who have a different attitude to time, to explain to them, A, these are the rules, B, this is why we have the rules, and C, equip students with an understanding that there needs to be, you know, I talked about this idea of acculturation, a way in which a learner learns to work within the new set of rules. So if you've always had your experience and your relationship with time has always been a very flexible one, then when you come to a country or an organization, which is very different, in most cases, I think a little bit of kind of, right, we need you to do this, and this is why we need you to do it, and now I'm going to give you some time to get used to it, is the way forward. And that's quite different from just saying, oh, Brazilians are always late.
Yeah, I also know instances where it's not necessarily about time, you know, where a teacher has come to me and said, you know, or I've said to a teacher, how's the new group going? And the teacher will say, oh, we're okay, except for this student, but they don't really take part much, but that's okay because they're this nationality, you know, for example, they're Japanese, so I don't expect them to talk much in class. And
oh dear.
yeah, and then it's wait, are you sure? And actually on further digging we realized that the student's in totally the wrong level. And it's not, they're not being quiet because they're a nice, polite Japanese lady who doesn't like to speak too much in a mixed group or in a big group. It's actually because they don't understand what's happening in class. And but for 3 days, that teacher had just put it down to, it's a cultural thing. As teachers, we have to be so careful of, this is my point about really seeing the person rather than the nationality, and not just taking a very big brush and going, whoosh, that's the problem, you know. But such an interesting industry that we work in.
And Gabby's just raised a really valuable question, I think, in terms of teachers working in ELT, where they go to for more materials relating to culture. Gabby, if you could just come onto the mic a moment, please, because I just want to tease out what you mean about materials relating to culture. Is this the, how do I find out about, you know, traditions in country XYZ, or is it more about these cultural dimensions as a way of understanding cultural behaviour?
Hi, Neil.
Hi there. Hi, Gabby.
Hi, Neil. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
To be honest, I don't know. It just the question just came to my mind as I was listening to you, because obviously, I mean, we are not happy with how course books present culture, right? So we've already said a lot about it. So if that's the case, if our course books are not exactly helpful, then how can we generate more teaching materials? I mean, what, because it may say for students who come to this country to study English, it may be easier because you just use authentic materials, right? So this is part of teaching culture in the classroom, like say newspapers or I don't know, leaflets. So the daily, everyday things that that we read and use. But if you are a teacher, say in Italy, okay, how can you present? But yeah, again, you just asked me what kind of culture. Okay, let's say the British culture. So for students who in Italy who would like to know more about the British culture, not culture in the broad understanding of the sense, but the British culture, where would the teacher, or where should the teacher go?
I'm passing it over to you, Steve, because I'm just not sure a better answer
Okay.
I have. Ideas.
There are some pretty good course books based around British culture. Cambridge, I know, do one. Oxford do one as well. OUP. Some nice course books if the teacher is looking for course books purely, or photocopier books on British culture. Those do exist. What I would say is, I think in terms of culturing the classroom, as much as we talk a lot these days about queering the classroom, culturing the classroom is very similar. A lot of it is up to the teacher to look at the lesson that's in front of them if they have limited resources, and making a decision about how they treat that material. So if you do have that New English file spread in front of you with a man and a woman having dinner and being served by a lady, being served by a woman or a young girl, as it was in the picture, have that conversation about, and does this look like a normal setup to you? How does this work with your idea of England? How does this work with your idea of your country? In your country, are you likely to be served by a female rather than a male person? Is that more likely to happen? Which then pushes me into saying things that are very binary, which I hate doing.
I know, that's
but
actually, can we not bring in the third option now of, or does it not matter?
Or does it not matter? Yeah.
Is it not relevant? Or is it also binary?
Yeah.
Just 10 minutes before we started today, I was reading a newspaper article online from the Cardiff, one of the Cardiff newspapers, Wales Online, not known for its political correctness, it's got to be said, which was really interesting because it was about a story about someone, sadly, whose body had been found in the River Taff. And the police identified the person as being a 24-year-old non-binary person. And I thought, hallelujah, that's quite something. And I thought I would just love to have a general English class, and I'd take it in tomorrow and work with it. So I absolutely agree with you that, if we problematize the materials, I'm concerned, however, about the very concept of teaching British culture. Well, what is British culture? Is my British culture the same as your British culture? What is British culture? Is it EastEnders? Or was it the representation on ITV on a Monday night a couple of weeks ago of Keeping Up with the Aristocrats, the life of three families living in stately homes around the UK? I mean, which culture? And
red phone boxes and double-decker buses. That's what I would say.
And this is why I mentioned in chat about the work of English UK, because if we're thinking about what's happening in this country, in the UK itself, what is really nice that they have created this anti-racism working group. And one of the things they want to work with is the assumption that if you come to the UK to study in the UK in a language school, that you will stay in a family with a mother and a father, a 2.4 kids, and a car outside the front, and a garden with a white fence, because it just doesn't work like that anymore. Can I also, I'm conscious of time, it's very old. These are two books that I suggested as extra reading. This one, Culture Bound, Jean Merrill Valdez, is one of the first books. I mean, it's 1982, if memory serves me correctly, 1986, that actually looks at how to work with culture in the classroom. If we're thinking about not just a nationality culture, but if we're thinking about culture and as it goes into business English and business training, unfortunately, it's out of print. I managed to pick up this copy for £3.50. They typically go for 20-something pounds. And that's Intercultural Business Communication by Robert
great book.
Gibson. And this goes through a lot of those cultural dimensions, the challenge of interculturality. And I think what it does, it just actually makes us step back and think about, well, how does culture work methodologically? And I think that would actually almost be my starting point. Before you start thinking about, am I using authentic materials? I mean, if you look at the representation of football in the Telegraph, the Independent and the Sun, it's going to be entirely different. The cultures of the newspapers as authentic material reinforces, problematizes a particular view. So there is, nothing is truly monocultural. That's the challenge.
And I think one of the wonderful things we have in ELT, really, particularly, we're an industry that generally teaches young adults, And we have a generation of young adults in general, I'm generalizing, who love to discuss, debate, and get involved. And I think it's really nice to push conversation in directions that we wouldn't have been able to 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, because we do have a far more connected generation of students in front of us. So I think it is up to the teacher, even with limited resources, if you've got a course book and that's what you're teaching, challenge it, challenge the imagery within the course book, discuss the culture that's portrayed within the course book, and see, where that goes with your group. There's no right or wrong answer. What there is, well, what there are lots of really nice opinions in your group that you can share, and so much wonderful language being used, getting those opinions out, sharing those opinions, and asking about other opinions. Yeah.
Gabby, I'm flattered. It's really interesting, isn't it, that this topic has generated so many questions. Gabby tells us that she's got 2 questions and they're big ones, and that she's going to post them on the forum. I'm conscious of time, Gabby. But yes, do post them on the forum, but not just the forum. I'd be inclined to stick them on Facebook. I'd be inclined to stick them in social media and get the whole, there's some wonderful Facebook groups, Cell to Delta Survivors Group, Cell to Delta Trainers Group, and stick them in there, because you need multiple sources, I think, to get towards the right answer. And everyone's saying, yes. Eleanor's saying, please share. And Gabby said, will do. Fantastic. Great.
I feel a part 2 coming up from you, Neil. I fear that Gabby and Hedy need to get you involved for a second cultural session. I think there's a lot of stuff to look at.
We're lining up the repeats at this stage. There was another one I was involved in where I was like, we need a repeat. Thank you for that, Steve. And please come along as panelist for them.
You're welcome.
But, that's a conversation perhaps Gabby and I can have at 11 o'clock tomorrow, 10:30 tomorrow morning, when we're talking anyway.
Super.
Steve, a pleasure as always. It's great to be reunited with you across the computer screen.
Yeah, lovely to see you, and entertaining as ever and as insightful as ever. Thank you so much, Neil.